I've gone through so many documentaries and stuff on World War II and Hitler and his relationship to religion, and it is wild how many lies are told in normal documentaries, like stuff that you would normally trust about Hitler's relationship to the church. So I want to listen to this. I don't actually know if there's any legitimacy to it. We'll see in a second. The title of it is Why Hitler Hated Christianity.
The Nazis repudiated two of the fundamental values that Christianity has always enshrined, and one of them you just touched on, the idea that the survival of the fittest, that the idea that to be strong is to be good. It's kind of fairly fundamental idea, say for the Greeks. I mean, they kind of conflated, good beauty and a goodness and strength. This it was to be a good person.
Okay, well, right out the gate, I can clearly see he's trying to conflate the Nazis with evolutionists, quote unquote, when in reality, it had very little to do with evolution, and it had everything to do with racial science, quote unquote, race theory. Race is not real, by the way. The concept of race is fabricated and has existed since long before evolution. It was created, I believe, by a guy named Carl Linnaeus, I think, in the 1730s. And he found the idea for this, not through evolution, which didn't exist, but through studying plants and the way that, like botany, basically, the way that you can like breed plants and things like that. And that's the basis for eugenics, which is not the same as evolution. Nazis embraced eugenics and race science. Of course, they accepted evolution, but evolution was reasonably young at the time and not really like at the forefront of anything. I think 1859 is when Darwin published his book on the origin of species or whatever. And it was translated to German in 1860. And it took time to propagate through the scientific community. By that time, I think most scientists had accepted evolution as a fact, but that's not what Nazi beliefs were based on. Also, what he said here at the beginning, one more time.
It's kind of fairly fundamental idea, say for the Greeks. I mean, they kind of...
Wait.
The Nazis repudiated two of the fundamental values that Christianity has always enshrined. And
one of the primary, I don't know what he's about to say, but the primary thing that Nazis rejected about Christianity that was kind of fundamental to the Christian belief system is the idea that everybody can come to Jesus and be saved. And that was the heart of the disagreement and the battle between the Nazi movement and what was called the confessing church, because there were confessions that everybody read when they were confirmed as Lutherans at like 13. You had to memorize these confessions. And it was things like, I believe in Jesus, and I believe that, God and the Holy Spirit and Jesus are one, and so on and so forth. It was that kind of thing. Well, there was one of them called the Athanasian Creed, maybe, I think was the name of it. And it basically said anybody can come to Jesus and be saved. Well, the Nazis rejected that because they believed that Jews were a race of people. There's that race science or race pseudoscience garbage again. And that as a race of people, they were not qualified to become Christians. That was the heart of the disagreement. And somewhere around 10% of the church split off from from the broader church, because the broader church turned Nazi. That's the bottom line.
Person. But of course, the other fundamental Christian ideal that the Nazis repudiate is the idea that, as Paul put it, there is no Jew or Greek. And that in turn is a kind of refinement of the teaching of Genesis, that God creates man and woman in his image. And therefore...
I'm sorry, what? God creates man and woman in his image, and you got to race science isn't real from that, okay?
If men and women are created in the image of God, every human being has an inherent dignity. And this is an idea that over the course of the Middle Ages kind of feeds into the idea that human beings have rights, that if, and this is something that that churchmen and lawyers in the 12th century start to extrapolate from.
No. Are you telling me you think the church throughout history in the past 2,000 years has been an avatar of human rights. They've been carrying the banner to expand human rights. You cannot be real with this. Please stop. Just a reminder, I would really appreciate it if you guys checked out my Patreon. If you're not going to donate, you don't have to, but follow me there at the very least. owenmorgan.com/Patreon. Just in case something happens with the government or whatever. It would be really good if you had some way to connect with me and my content. I'm really concerned about that. And maybe you should consider that for other creators too.
The gospel teachings, if Christ is saying to the wealthy, you have a duty to feed the hungry and to clothe those who have no clothes and to give shelter to those who are homeless, then it follows that the hungry have a right to food, and those without clothes have a right to clothes, and those who don't have a home have a right to a home. And so you start to get the idea that human beings have inherent rights.
From the church. You think the church expanded human rights? Please get help.
And these are ideas that secularized feed into the American Revolution, into the French Revolution, into United Nations. It's a very, very profound idea that today, for lots of people who believe in human rights, they tend to kind of assume that they are immanent.
This really disgusts me when I hear people say things like this, that the secular world has drawn from Christianity to support human rights. That is like a rewriting of history that is egregious. And not just that, it's egregious and disgusting to me to listen to people completely rewrite. I mean, this is a random video that I found on World War II era Christianity. Just the first one that showed up in the search, and it's egregiously wrong. That bothers me so much.
But in the long run, when you look at it in the kind of historical perspective, to believe in human rights requires just as much a leap of faith as believing that the Lord Jesus Christ rose on the third day and ascended into heaven.
To believe in human rights requires just as much faith as to believe in Jesus? What?
I mean, these are theological precepts, theological ideas that have been bred specifically of Christian history. And the genius of the West has been to kind of package them and market them as though somehow they've been, removed from the Christian context that gave them birth.
Yeah. This is a joke, dude.
And I think that one of the things that we're seen over the past few decades, really since the 21st century, is that as Western power and influence retreats, so more and more of the world is kind of basically saying, well, these ideas, these ideals are, these are culturally contingent. These are your ideas. They're not our ideas.
What?
And I think that this is unsettling for people in the West precisely because we have the kind of, the shadow of the Nazis hangs over us, because the Nazis absolutely did think against Paul that Jews and Greeks were completely separate. And we know where that
against Paul
led. And part of the horror of the Holocaust, the kind of the horror and the most grotesque irony in the history of Christendom is that Hitler saw St. Paul, who said there is no Jew or Greek, as the embodiment of a kind of pernicious a Jewish cosmopolitanism that he saw.
Yeah, Hitler hated Paul and all of Paul's writings, and they basically released new versions of the Bible that did not contain any of Paul's writings. He called him a rabbi, and they kept Jesus' writings. In fact, Hitler's favorite Bible verse, funny enough, was the verse where Jesus, in John, he sat outside of the temple braiding a whip and then went inside and whipped the shit out of the Jews and the money changers and everything. He called him the first Aryan and the first anti-Semite. Jesus was, in Hitler's mind. Anyway, by the time they were done, trimming down the Bible to what they wanted it to contain, they had removed, over half of it. A bunch of New Testament books, some of the Old Testament stuff was removed.
By the way, guys, check out my new shop, owenmorgan.com/shop. I have a bunch of really cool designs on there.
As having destroyed Greece and Rome, He thought this idea that there is no Jew or Greek, that there is no slave or free, that there is no man or woman, had corrupted classical civilization and destroyed it.
So your thinking behind that is Hitler thought that the Jews were subhuman, they were not human, and somehow they climbed under the idea.
He saw them as the most dangerous enemy of the strong. That Paul is preaching Christ crucified. He's preaching this dead man on a cross. He's preaching this universalism, this cosmopolitanism, and this destroys the Roman Empire. And so Hitler thinks that if his Reich is going to last 1,000 years and not be brought down by a creeping Jewish cosmopolitanism, then he has to get rid of the Jews. But there's a case for saying that he targets the Jews for genocide because he blames them for Christianity, which
because he blames them for Christianity? Hitler was a Christian. Hitler was a Christian. In fact, like the NSDAP, the Nazi Party original name, the Nationalsozialistische Deutsche Arbeiterpartei, that's what it was originally called, the Nazi Party. Their 25-point declaration or plan or whatever specifically listed a bunch of Christian stuff in it. So I don't know what you're talking about. By the end of his life, it's arguable that he had gotten sick of, well, he was certainly sick of the clergy. He was certainly sick of all of the people who, pulled strings, and he didn't want to deal with anybody in positions of power in Christianity anymore. He wanted to own those institutions himself. And it's arguable that he had moved away from traditional Christianity by the end of his life, by the last few years of the war. But even that is up in the air. He was raised Catholic. He was very Christian. He was confirmed as a Catholic, not just baptized, but confirmed as a Catholic at a young age. He just didn't like that other people controlled institutions, and he wanted to control those institutions. That's all. That's what it was.
Considering the fact that he draws on obviously all kinds of kind of very venerable Christian, anti-Semitic, anti-Jewish propaganda. I mean, it's just the most hideous irony and paradox.
One more time.
Last 1,000 years and not be brought down by a creeping Jewish cosmopolitanism, then he has to get rid of the Jews. But there's a case for saying that he targets the Jews for genocide because he blames them for Christianity.
That's complete nonsense. There is not one grain of truth to that. That's complete garbage.
Which, considering the fact that he draws on obviously all kinds of kind of very venerable Christian, anti-Semitic, anti-Jewish propaganda, I mean, it's just the most hideous irony and paradox.
Yeah, that was just complete nonsense. That whole thing was just nonsense. Who is this guy? John? It bothers me so much that people can just come on here and just make shit up brazenly with absolutely no basis in reality. And I'll look this guy up later. Anyway, tell me what you think about it in the comments. This is just ridiculous.